Hey adapters, welcome back. Today our guest is Laura Schifter. Laura is a senior fellow leading the K-12 Climate Action initiative with the Aspen Institute. Laura is also a lecturer in education with the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a fellow with the Century Foundation. Laura will discuss how the K-12 Climate Action initiative is enabling the education sector to contribute to climate action, solutions, and environmental justice. She shares insights how this initiative is incorporating resilience and adaptation planning into school standards and curriculum, and helping reduce the environmental footprint of these schools. Hi, Laura. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Doug. Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, I love this topic, talking about education and how it's going to be embedded in schools. But first, could you give us some context and what is the Aspen Institute?
Yeah, so the Aspen Institute is a broader organization that's really working to bring people together to help solve some of the biggest issues of our time. And one of the things that we started to do with K-12 Climate Action specifically is we noticed that the education sector at a systems level has not been very vocal in its role in addressing climate change. And likewise, large-scale climate solutions often don't consider the role that education can play. But there's both a huge need and an opportunity to help our schools move towards climate action. There's a need because our schools are a very large public sector, and there's an opportunity because schools help educate the 50 million children and youth enrolled in those schools, and can really be a player in helping ensure that more students are prepared to advance sustainability in the future. So what we're really working to do with K-12 Climate Action is bring together people within the education sector. We've launched a commission that's co-chaired by former Secretary of Education John King and former Governor and EPA Administrator Christy Todd Whitman, along with 22 major education, environment, civil rights, youth leaders in this space, to really come together and help develop an action plan to support schools in this work.
Okay, so you mentioned some of the people that are on the commission, and the commission is active right now. There was a launch, and at the time you weren't traveling, but is that in the cards now? What's really going on with the commission right now?
So the commission's held a series of listening sessions. So they've held 6 listening sessions to learn about the needs and opportunities to engage schools in this work. Those listening sessions are actually all available online. And what the commission is doing now, we're currently working with the commissioners to develop that action plan. And they're working to then release the action plan in line with a summit that will be in September 2021. We are still determining whether that will be virtual, in person, or hybrid. But a big chunk of it will be accessible to folks who are interested in tuning in and seeing what the commission has to say.
Okay, yeah, I guess that's a big question mark if you actually do it in person, but there's still a lot of successful summits that are happening virtually. But as you shoot for that September date, this action plan, hopefully you want it to influence educators, policymakers. Like who's invited to this summit, and who are you hoping will participate in what you're doing there?
Yeah, our hope is to really reach broad perspectives within the education sector. So anything from educators in the schools, superintendents, state leaders in education, and policymakers to help think about how they can support and scale this work in schools. So what our commissioners are really coming together around are thinking about, well, what is it that a local school district can really do well in this space? And how can school district policy help accelerate climate action in schools? How can state level policy help accelerate climate action in schools? And of course, how can federal policy help accelerate that action in schools?
Okay, so we've talked about the commission, and we'll get back to that because that's the sort of the broader umbrella of what you're doing there. But let's just, I guess, get into why this is so important. So why is it important for schools to reduce their environmental footprint?
So, there are nearly 100,000 schools across the country. So actually our school system is a large public sector. They're among the largest consumers of energy within the public sector, with 480,000 school buses. They operate the largest mass transit fleet in the sector. They serve over 7 billion meals annually in a traditional year. So they have a large environmental footprint, and there's a big opportunity to actually move schools to reduce that environmental footprint. Consider strategies like adding solar to schools, which has benefit in terms of reducing the environmental footprint and has benefit in terms of saving school districts money, which is something that we've seen. There's a school district, Batesville, Arkansas, that actually the school district itself was running a deficit. They made the decision to invest in solar purely based on budgetary needs. And actually now they're generating a surplus, and they're actually able to use those funds to repurpose it to increase teacher pay. So in addition to reducing the environmental footprint for schools, there's also a lot of other benefits that schools can get in terms of taking climate action.
Okay, so there's a lot of inertia, I guess, dealing with schools and those things and I'm talking about school buses too, because what we've been hearing more recently is about replacing the mail fleet, the mail truck fleet, and that in itself is so difficult to do. Is that something that's, I guess, a reachable target? Is you look at all these school buses and they are just put into the system for decades.
Yeah, it's something that'll take time to transition, but school districts are working towards that. And there's a lot of policy that can actually help accelerate and scale that. Montgomery County, just here in Maryland, they actually have now signed an agreement to set themselves on a path to transition their entire school bus fleet to electric over the next 10 years. They're working with a company called Highland Electric. Highland Electric is essentially offsetting the excess cost of the school bus, so that the school district actually doesn't have to take on the additional costs up front, but they then pay a lease to Highland Electric over time and then are able to transition their entire school bus fleet. And that has, health benefits for the kids. You're no longer breathing dirty diesel. It has benefits for the environment. And so what we're hopeful is that a lot of other school districts will start seeing what school districts are doing and then get on that path themselves.
Okay, one of the things that I think is so exciting about what you're doing is that you're talking about adaptation. So much of the climate conversation is about mitigating your carbon footprint, which is obviously very important. But adaptation is part of your planning too. What does it mean for a school district, a school to adapt to climate change?
So there are a lot of things to think about when you're talking about adaptation for school districts. I think, one of the things that we've seen to even heighten this year is that our school systems are not well equipped to deal with learning disruptions. And we've seen that in terms of COVID at a heightened level. But these disruptions are occurring across the country related to extreme weather events, which we're seeing also increasingly occur with climate change, and even things like what we were just talking about in terms of extreme heat. Schools are closing because they don't have the infrastructure in place to help cool their buildings enough so that students can learn in the building. And these are things that are going to increasingly occur as climate change worsens. So one of the things that school districts really need to think about and prepare for is how they adapt. And there are certain things that they need to consider. For instance, do they have adequate plans in place to think about continuing learning needs for students in the event of situations like extreme weather events or even just issues like extreme heat? What are the plans in place to help students continue learning? What are the plans in place to ensure that there's adequate mental health support for children and youth in the wake of these events? And there's really an opportunity for school districts to be more forward thinking in how they prepare and consider the climate risks that they're susceptible to dependent on their location.
Okay, so if schools get involved with adaptation planning, but what about local communities? How can they leverage the schools into their own adaptation planning?
So schools are in every community, which means they're a beneficial resource. And actually, schools can be resiliency hubs for communities. One of the things that we've seen is Santa Barbara School District actually invested in solar in their schools so that when there are rolling power outages to help reduce the chance of wildfires in the community, people within the community can actually go to the schools to plug in whatever essential items they have. And schools can be used as shelters. schools can really be an essential part of community planning as they think about adaptation and resilience in preparation for climate change.
All right, so most schools, if not all, are run really at this local level. You know, the federal government sets some standards, the state sets some standards, but really local decisions are what are driving these schools. How do you influence that process?
I think one of the things that what we are trying to do in particular is help establish a framework by which school districts can think about this. So just even posing the questions in terms of what is it that school districts need to think about in terms of, mitigation, adaptation, education, and equity is one way to provide a backbone to say, look, school districts, if you want to have this conversation, these are some areas that you need to think about. And help share best practices so that you can say, Santa Barbara's done this or Miami has done this, and help try and translate that across different districts. But there are a lot of ways that people in local communities can help act and take action in this space. One of the last people that we heard from in one of our listening sessions was actually president of National PTA. And local PTAs can really help engage and get themselves involved in terms of asking what their school boards are doing in this area. Another big thing that we've seen is youth activism in this space to actually, there's youth activism going on across the country on climate, but there's a way for youth to kind of come together and ask their school leaders, what are we doing to help reduce our environmental footprint, and kind of push conversations at the local level to really scale this work.
Okay, so in the actual act of teaching climate change, the teachers are out there. They're the ones on the front lines dealing with students and parents and such. How can schools be more supportive and how facilitate that process?
So there are a lot of different ways that educators can help think about integrating climate change in the curriculum. I think there's, oftentimes we default to thinking about what needs to be taught in terms of climate change, in terms of the climate science, but actually climate change presents an opportunity to really think about and teach issues related to climate change across the curriculum. One area where we've seen a state really lead on this is New Jersey. They just passed standards last summer that actually integrates climate change across the curriculum. So if you're, in social studies and you're learning about economy and geography and politics, that they are considering how climate change is impacting those issues and thinking about climate change in a different way. If you're in science, you're learning about the climate science and how humans are impacting and causing climate change. But there are also other opportunities. This is an existential threat. This is the biggest issue of our time, and children are going to need to grapple with that in different ways. And you can see places where art can be a real opportunity for students to be able to express themselves and help elevate the importance of this issue. So educators can provide a space by which children can learn about these issues and kind of express themselves in different ways to really get to how they are thinking about these issues and ultimately come to solutions. I mean, one of the biggest things that we've seen when we've talked to folks about this is, people will talk about issues related to eco-anxiety and students feeling overwhelmed and try and use that as a reason not to teach the science on climate change. But actually, if eco-anxiety is a problem, what we've seen is one way to reduce eco-anxiety is not just teach the science, but teach students about the solutions and teach them how to have agency to take action for climate solutions. And a lot of those can be enacted within their schools. So I think kind of thinking about that, educators can have a very powerful role in helping prepare the rising generation to advance sustainability.
Obviously, in some communities, climate change is still controversial. And with these listening sessions that you just, or I guess still in the middle of or completed, some teachers just avoid the topic altogether. And you think about evolution and how climate change is sort of falling into that. Have you heard from people that they've come up with successful ways of, even if a parent complains, the school district has their back. What have you been hearing sort of from people out there doing these things when it becomes controversial?
So we actually heard from a teacher in Oklahoma, a fantastic 4th, fifth grade teacher, I believe, who's teaching climate change through science in Oklahoma. And she's in, oil and gas country. And one of the things that she really found, she was nervous at first about teaching climate change, but felt extremely passionate about the need to teach her students more about climate change to prepare them. And what she found within her community is actually there was a lot more acceptance in her community than she originally expected, in part because she tied it to local issues. And ultimately tying it to local issues and what people in the community care about. And she talked about how people in her community care about the land, and really tying it to what people care about within their community. What are the things that people are experiencing in their community, and connecting the dots that way is one path forward to help then teach climate change in the classroom.
Okay, so you just used that example in Oklahoma, and I guess I'm going to ask for another example of, is there a particular school district or school that's really doing mitigation and adaptation very well? Because there's a lot of schools that, they're all over mitigation, but they're doing both of those really well.
I think what we've seen more is pockets of work. And there's one place where I think that there's a lot of exciting things that could happen. Miami is one community where I think a lot of exciting things could happen. They've had to deal with issues around adaptation more than a lot of other areas. They took in a lot of students post Hurricane Maria. And so they've had to think about these issues a little bit more in terms of changing enrollment patterns, providing different academic supports in the wake of these extreme weather events. And actually, they were better equipped to transition to virtual learning in the time of COVID because they had thought about these issues as it relates to climate change. And their school district or their school board actually just passed a resolution committing their school district to go to 100% clean energy by 2030. So they are taking steps in both the adaptation planning as well as being aggressive and thinking about how they're going to mitigate for climate change as well. That is a resolution. It's a commitment with goals. And so they need to work towards implementing that resolution, but it is something at a policy level that they have said and made a priority. And so it'll be exciting to see how Miami does with that. And there are other school districts that are really working towards those same objectives as well. Oakland is another one in California that has passed a similar resolution at the school board level and has had to deal a lot with adaptation issues with wildfires that they've seen there. Salt Lake City is another school district that has passed an 100% clean energy resolution. So we're just at this kind of moment of, a tipping point in terms of action on this. And I think with youth really mobilizing on this, parents and communities really mobilizing on this, we'll see more and more districts really acting on these issues as it goes forward. And our hope is that we make sure that they kind of think about them in that more comprehensive approach and thinking about mitigation, adaptation, and education altogether.
And there's actually an opportunity to advance equity in this work that you're doing. How is that?
I think the real opportunity to advance equity, we know that climate change disproportionately impacts communities of color and low-income communities. What we are seeing right now, as I just mentioned, is that schools have yet to make this transition a full reality. And so what we can do is if we are really forward thinking in this moment, if there are opportunities to enact federal policy to help address these issues, we can center equity from the get-go and say, actually, we're going to help prioritize, subsidizing school bus transition in the communities that need it most. And right now, since, this hasn't fully taken off yet, it's a way that we can work to advance equity and ensure that there aren't gaps ahead. What we really need to see are these policies to help advance this and ensure that we're providing the resources for under-resourced schools to enable them to make this transition a success. But there is an opportunity here that we can advance equity in this work ahead.
Okay, so you kind of mentioned it there, but the Biden administration is really starting to focus on climate change and all sorts of policies being suggested and such. Are you guys part of that conversation, or are you seeing advocates trying to bring climate education into anything that kind of goes forward?
Yeah, so there's some exciting work that's happening. I think one of the things that we've seen that's exciting is the Secretary of Education is a part of the National Climate Task Force that the Biden administration has established to really take this whole of government approach on climate change. And so symbolically, I think that that is an important step, the recognition and the importance of education in this work. And there's also some proposals that have been in place that will help address this work as well. The American Jobs Plan, which is the administration's infrastructure plan that they're working with Congress to kind of put forward and negotiate right now. That does include $100 billion for school infrastructure investments to help, really address buildings and grounds, not just to take them up to par, but really think about what are the things that our school buildings need to be models of sustainability for the future. And so thinking about opportunities to invest in renewable energy in schools. The American Jobs Plan also has, I believe it's $25 billion proposal through that to help support transitioning the school bus fleet from diesel to electric. And I think that's projected to help transition 20% of America's school buses from diesel to electric. So I think there are really promising pillars in place. Administrator Michael Regan of the EPA is very committed to climate education. He's held some conversations with science teachers. Him, along with the Secretary of Education, have done an infrastructure event with our commission as well to elevate some of these opportunities to invest in school infrastructure to help address climate change. And so I think there's a lot of promising work in place that the Biden administration has done thus far. Ultimately, it's all got to get over the finish line, and the infrastructure bill has to pass, and some of these other components will need to pass as well. I'm hopeful that this is a real opportunity to address these issues, but we'll see how it goes in the weeks and months ahead.
Okay, so as we wrap this up, what's next for you? I guess the big summit is the big target that you're looking for, but like the next 6 months, what's keeping you busy?
So the summit, and we're starting to think about what we can really help do in terms of supporting campaigns and supporting other efforts after the summit to ensure that the policy recommendations that our commissioners have come together on can really help take action and take root in schools. So we're working to connect with other organizations that have networks of folks like networks of school board members, networks of state and local policymakers to help provide additional education and support on these issues to really help mobilize this action across the country. We would love for folks, if they're interested in learning more, to come to K12climateaction.org and follow along with the commission, join us for the summit, and really help take action in your community locally, because ultimately that's what's going to get us over the edge here is really having people realize that they can go to their local schools and local school boards and really push for this change.
Okay, Laura, this has been fantastic. What you are doing is incredibly important, and not even just in the short term. You think about climate education over the next 30, 50. We're going to be dealing with climate change. It'll be interesting to see how it even evolves over that time frame, but everyone's going to have to be aware of this issue, and you're there at the ground zero. So I'm going to take you into just chatting, but thank you so much for coming on Simpatico.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, we'll be right back. Hold on just one sec.